All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Even though that the letters in ACC symbolize it as the Atlantic Coast Conference, one can now say that it stands for All Coast Conference. ACC school presidents voted today to welcome Stanford, Cal, and SMU into their ranks for the next academic year. The move comes after a month of going back and forth, as the notion is that this will allow the conference to keep up with the Joneses. The demise of the once powerful Pac 12 has resulted in UCLA, USC, Oregon, and Washington joining the Big Ten, while Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah are headed to the Big 12. And these moves left Cal, Stanford, Washington State, and Oregon State to fend for themselves in the Pac 12. Desperation time, definitely, for Cal and Stanford as they're seeking to get money from a power conference. And of course, in the case of Stanford, their Olympic sports that are a big part of their athletic program. For me, this just screams of desperation, as it's also desperation time for the ACC as they're trying to keep up with the SEC and Big Ten as far as revenue. And that right there is a losing proposition. The ACC is also attempting to keep its members happy. As you know, it's no secret that schools such as Florida State and Clemson are not happy with the revenue payouts that they're getting in contrast to both the SEC and Big Ten. And of course, you could throw schools like North Carolina and North Carolina State into that mix as well. Now, call me a pessimist, but to me, adding SMU, Cal, and Stanford to the ACC, all it is just reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. And I say that because Stanford, Cal, and SMU coming to the ACC is not going to keep Florida State and Clemson happy. What it could do for the ACC is now this could somewhat cushion a blow, if you will, if Florida State and Clemson and others decide to leave the conference in coming years. But nonetheless, we've just completely jumped the shark. And I'm going to touch base a little bit more on that before I'm done here. Now, you look at it once again, you're asking student athletes to travel cross country for games. As you know, the ACC, they're attempting to follow the model that both the Big Ten and Big 12 have created. And honestly, as a reach at best, you're hearing reports coming out now that for some sports, the meeting point could be Dallas, because now in order to cut down on the travel from the East Coast to the West Coast or vice versa. And I'm like, wow, this is a real reach at best. And honestly, it's sad to say that people are getting paid a lot of money to think these things out. But at the end of the day, I really feel, and I said this before, once Oregon and Washington went to the Big Ten, once Utah and Arizona and the others went to the Big 12, I felt like the other four remaining Pac 12 schools should have just tried to stay committed to the West Coast, and especially in the case of Stanford and Cal. And the reason why is, are the kids in the non football sports really going to want to travel cross country? It looks all well and good for football, but at the end of the day, baseball, tennis, swimming, and so many others, are those kids really going to want to do the travel cross country just for a conference meet? That's the $1 million question right now. Now, the big winner in all of this, in my opinion, is SMU, as for the first time since their days in the now defunct Southwest Conference, they're back in a power conference. And SMU, if you follow their story, it's a very interesting one, because when they got hit with the death penalty by the NCAA in the mid 1980s, it not only set their athletic program back, it was the beginning of the end for the Southwest Conference, because they lost out on TV money for several years. And in the case of SMU, they watched like some of their Southwest Conference brethren, Arkansas going to the SEC. Then, of course, Texas and Texas Tech and several others being a part of the initial Big 12 conference. And now, of course, Texas is going to the SEC as well. But if you're SMU, you had to travel through the likes of the now defunct Western Athletic Conference, Conference USA, the American Athletic Conference, and now you somewhat now again have a seat at the big boy table, if you will. Along with that, of course, they're bringing the Dallas media market with them to the ACC. Now, the SEC, this is the only conference, the power conferences that is, that have not cashed in on the demise of the Pac 12, and it's not by accident. Yes, the SEC just expanded because, of course, Oklahoma and Texas are joining the fray next year. But it's one of those where Oklahoma and Texas are bringing a lot of cachet with them to the SEC. And then on top of that, you figure it's a kind of a southeast southwest type thing because you already had Texas A&M, you got LSU, you got Arkansas, so that somewhat cuts down the travel for those guys at that region of the SEC. But nonetheless, they've still focused on their roots, if you will, which are the southeast region. And then on top of that, if you're the SEC, once you eliminate Oregon, Washington, USC, and UCLA from the mix, it really doesn't make sense for you to go after anybody in the now defunct or about to be defunct Pac-12 conference if you're looking to add members. So I could definitely understand where the SEC is coming from on that matter. Now, what is next for Washington State and Oregon State? And they've been disrespected so much throughout this entire matter because you hear the stories, and for the most part, the remaining members of the Pac 12, once Colorado agreed to leave to the Big 12, felt like they were coming in that morning to sign a grants of right deal and move on with a new media package. And then, of course, Oregon and Washington, broke the news they were going to the Big 10. And right after that, Utah and Arizona and so many others, they had their foot out the door heading to the Big 12. And, Washington State lost their tag team partner in Washington. So the Apple Cup's done. Oregon State lost their tag team partner in Oregon. So the Civil War's done. And now they're left, behind in the dust, if you will. I think, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, it's not going to matter as far as what the decisions that are made, obviously, but, they have several options. Attempt to carry the Pac 12 banner, which gets tougher and tougher day by day, join the Mountain West, join the American Athletic Conference, or possibly try to join the Big 12. For me at this point, I really do think the best option for Oregon State and Washington State would be to join the Mountain West because you look at it, you're not going to get the money that you were hopeful to get from a new Pac 12 TV deal, obviously. But you still keep a foothold on the West Coast. I think joining the American would be a reach. You probably would get some better TV money in the American than the Mountain West, but you also have to consider the travel for all of your programs. The Big 12, it's one of those where if the Big 12 really wanted Oregon State and Washington State, they could have them. I'm not sure if they do. So the scenario right there could kind of be like what has happened for Stanford and Cal, because Stanford and Cal, once they realized that Oregon and Washington were going to the Big Ten, they tried to get in as well, and the Big Ten simply didn't want them. And in my opinion, as good as things have been going for the Big Ten, I think that could be a mistake for them. I think with the Olympic sports and with the legacy and the lineage and all that other stuff, I do believe that if the Big Ten was going to go west like they have, I think they should have gone after Stanford and Cal as well. But that obviously did not happen. But nonetheless, getting back to Oregon State and Washington State, in my opinion, I think the best move for them at this point would be to join the Mountain West. You still have a foot in that region because obviously so many West Coast schools in the Mountain West already, and I think you would have an opportunity to thrive and flourish in that conference in all of your sports. That's just my opinion right there. Now, the Mountain West as a whole, in my opinion, could come out of this thing smelling like a rose. And I say that because let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Oregon State and Washington State decide to go to the Mountain West. Now, you have a better opportunity if you're this league to go out there and get the kids, regardless of the sport, who don't want to travel all across the country to play games. Now you have an opportunity to get those kids, those California kids, those Washington kids, those Nevada kids, you name it, who don't feel like traveling across country and saying, hey, I want to stay close to home. Hey, I want my family to be able to come to my games and whatnot. Those kids are going to think twice now. Now, don't get me wrong. The five-star recruits for football or basketball, they're still going to go to the big schools, but you're still going to have an opportunity to get those kids who are looked over in football and basketball. And of course, the other sports. You're going to have an opportunity now, if you're the Mountain West, to come out there and get these kids because, hey, there might be a kid in Southern California right now that doesn't feel like traveling cross country to play a sport in the Big Ten or the Big 12 or the ACC. He could stay home in the Mountain West. And if you go to San Diego State, you stay in state to play Fresno State. You stay in state to play San Jose State. You've got Nevada, you've got UNLV, you've got Wyoming, you've got Boise, you've got that region. So that's something to think about. And I think Oregon State and Washington State, obviously from a geographical standpoint, could fit into that equation and simply make it worse. Now, it's still sad because you know when I listen to a guy like Bill Walton, talk on TV, and he's always proud to call the Pac-12 conference the Conference of Champions, and it's been around for more than 100 years. And this demise is all because some people in the Pac-12 overestimated their value for a new television deal. And it's unfortunate because, like I've said before, and I'm going to say it again, yes, the Pac-12 did overestimate their worth as a league. There's been a lack of leadership for a very long time. And then there was some arrogance within the conference because the Pac-12 needed to realize what was going on. They needed to bring in guys like Boise State or San Diego State sooner, but they were still looking at it from an academia, endowment standpoint, where it's like, you know what, in this day and age, unfortunately, for your conference to survive, it comes down to football and then everything else. And if cooler heads had prevailed, if the Pac-12 had checked its egos, respective egos, at the door, we're probably not talking about this topic in the manner that we are. But unfortunately, this is the name of the game. And I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. I am thankful that I was able to watch sports in an era when rivalries meant something. You think about the rivalries that have been destroyed collegiately over about the last 25 to 30 years or so due to realignment. The Apple Cup, and of course, people on the East Coast or Midwest might not pay attention to that, but that's a big game between Washington and Washington State. That's about to be extinct. The same thing with Oregon and Oregon State. People on the East Coast don't understand, what it meant when USC and Cal or USC Stanford played each other. People don't understand maybe on the East Coast from the basketball aspect to see UCLA rather play Arizona. You think about it in the Midwest region. There was a time in the old days of the Big Eight conference, and then of course in the Big 12 North, how big of a matchup the Colorado Nebraska game was football wise. The type of matchup that Nebraska Oklahoma was football wise. And then, we can shift to the East Coast, with some of the games that have been lost. Pitt, West Virginia. I know they've met, on the gridiron since, they've gone their separate ways. But at the end of the day, it simply is not the same. And these are just some of the rivalries, not to mention, the Texas rivalries. We're going to get Texas A&M and Texas A&M getting it back on when Texas goes to the SEC. But you think about it, in those old days of the Southwest Conference, with so many teams within the state of Texas, and what those games meant to each other. Kansas, Missouri, for another one on the hardwood, and I could just keep going on and on and on and on and on about this, but it's all about the rivalries, and of course, the Pac-12 schools going to the Big Ten, in my opinion, it doesn't taste right, if you will. And the same thing could be said about the Big 12 because you're just lumping in schools from all over the country, just trying to chase the dollar and so forth. And even with these expanded conferences, the rivalries within the conferences that are lost because we don't see Tennessee we're not going to see Tennessee play Alabama football wise as frequently as they should. LSU play Alabama, Florida play Tennessee, and so many others. Okay, and it's the same thing in the Big Ten with the Michigan and Minnesota. People don't understand, that little brown jug what it stands for as far as tradition, and we've just pushed tradition aside in the grand chase for money, if you will. And like I've said before, and I'm going to continue to say it, is that college football needs revenue sharing just like the pros. This is why we've gotten to this issue. You have the USCs and the Oklahomas of the world who would sit back in their conferences and see the Vanderbilts and the Rutgers and whomever else who don't have the rich football tradition sit back and cash bigger checks for their athletic programs than them. And that's what causes a problem. Anytime there is a difference financially, it is going to cause a problem. And this is why we have these mega conferences. And this is why these conferences are going to continue to expand. And until somebody gets ahead of this, until somebody comes to the forefront and becomes a leader on this issue, it is going to continue to be a problem. Now, the 1990s saw the demise of the Southwest Conference. The 2010s saw the destruction of the Big East for football. And here in the 2020s, the Pac 12 is cooked. So the question is going to be every time, every round of realignment, there is a conference that falls by the wayside. Which is going to be the next conference to fall? And honestly, in my opinion, it's the conference that I'm talking about right now, the ACC, because you've gone from a power five to a power four. Before it was a power six or big six, and of course the Big East went by the wayside. Now you've got a power four. It's going to be a power three at some point because you always have to look back and see which conference does not have solid footing underneath them, which conference doesn't have everybody on the same page. And right now, that conference is the ACC. The Big Ten is going to get its money. Like I said before, when USC and UCLA decided to join, you now have the three biggest media markets in your back pocket if you're the Big Ten. You can go in and talk turkey with any network executive in the nation and get a big payday. Not to mention the football powerhouses that you bring with it: Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State, USC now, Oregon, Washington, UCLA, and several others. They're set. The same for the SEC because you've got Texas, you've got Oklahoma, you've got Alabama, you've got Georgia, you've got Auburn, you've got LSU. You can go and talk turkey with anybody. Everybody is not on the same page in the ACC. Florida State is starting to win football games again. Florida State feels like they are ready to get back to being Florida State of the 1990s and that 1980s under Bobby Bowden. And then, of course, what they were becoming under Jimbo Fisher before he left. They feel like they're getting back to that. We know what Clemson is under Dabo Sweeney. These institutions want to be compensated like they should fairly. And before it came down to equal pay, and I'm not trying to talk bad about equal pay. When I say equal pay, I mean as far as the payouts for, the athletic programs, okay? When it came down to that, because there was a time when you basically got compensated based off of how you produced, how you won. And now, since the money's been spread out evenly among the conference members, it's really, changed the dynamic. And that's a problem for the big conferences or for the big programs, if you will. So, let's see what happens with this going forward because something has to give. And if it doesn't, this problem is going to continue to get worse. Now, with with that said, I don't see the ACC being able to survive compared to the Big 12, compared to the Big 10, and compared to the SEC. So I look at it like this. Could Florida State and Clemson at someplace down the line say, hey, you know what? We're going to become football independents. We're going to become a free agent, if you will, until some one of these other big conferences courts us and wants us. That could happen. I mean, honestly, if the SEC really wanted it, they could have Florida State, Clemson, and Miami just like that. And at some point, it could possibly happen. So it's going to be interesting to see how the ACC is going to be able to survive this. I don't see, and this is just me talking, I don't see Stanford and Cal being committed to the ACC long term. And I say that because if the Big Ten turns around at some point within the next 10 or 15 years and says, hey, we want Stanford and Cal in our league, they're going to make it happen. So I think the ACC is still the conference that is not on solid ground, in comparison to the others. Now, as far as this cross country mix for leagues and jumping out of regions for leagues and stuff like that, when things started to shift more than 10 years ago, there were people who said it wouldn't work. And on the surface, some people are going to say that it works, and and honestly, when you look between the lines, it hasn't because of the non-football sports, the non-basketball sports, where their travel and you name it has been uprooted. And I think this problem is going to get worse and it's going to intensify. And at some point, you have to ask yourself, when is enough going to be enough? There was a time when conferences focused on a region because the conferences themselves, along with school administrators, were more worried about the well-being of the student athletes. That is no longer the case. They're treating these young folks like professionals because this is the way that a professional league would act, but also a professional league comes with revenue sharing. Now, is all of the are all of these moves going to make Notre Dame join a conference for football? I'm going to say no. Notre Dame has a sweet deal. They have all of their sports except for football in the ACC. And they still get that NBC money. They're looking for new money, maybe from Amazon or another streaming outlet. We got to wait and see. But nonetheless, Notre Dame wants to have its cake and eat it too, and that's what they did when they were part of the Big East. And myself, like a lot of other people, felt that hey, if Notre Dame had simply joined the Big East for football, things would have been totally different. But that was not the case. And I don't see Notre Dame forcing their hand enough now to join the ACC for football just to keep the likes of Clemson and Florida State happy. They should do it because Notre Dame did it a couple of years ago during the COVID year, and they made the ACC championship game. But honestly, that NBC money, Amazon money, whatever, is just too much for them to pass up. So that's again the determining factor. This all comes down to money. So we got to wait, sit back and wait and see how this works out. But to me, I just really feel this is the ACC and Stanford and Cal really jumping the shark here. You have a scenario where when you're not the first person to get to the table and make that big move, you know, typically you become desperate. And after, the Big Ten got to the Pac-12 table first and got who they wanted, and then, the Big 12 came in right after that and got their fill. The ACC came in and tried to get some, and honestly, it just screams of desperation. I said it before, and I'll say it again. Stanford and Cal really wanted to be in the Big Ten, and even though it still would have been a cross country league for them, I felt like the Big Ten made more sense for Stanford and Cal than the ACC does because for the sake of argument, for Stanford and Cal to go to the Big Ten, you've already got Washington and Oregon there. You've already got USC and UCLA there. That cuts down somewhat on the travel, at least. You have other brethren from the West Coast, if you will. But this right here from the ACC just doesn't make sense. They're just trying to hold on. And anytime you try to hold on just to make moves, at some point it's going to fall. It's going to blow up in your face. Think back to the old Big East Conference when they were trying to hold on to keep, their football members happy. And this came after Boston College, Miami, and Virginia Tech agreed to leave the conference for the ACC. They brought in DePaul, which didn't have a football program. They brought in Louisville. They brought in Cincinnati. They brought in Marquette in South Florida. Yes, that was able to keep them afloat and happy, but it only within 10 years, it was all done. So I think the same thing can be said for the ACC. Nobody should be surprised at this point if a conference goes by the wayside because we've said farewell to tradition a long time ago, and it's unfortunate what's happening to the Pac-12. It's unfortunate what happened to the Southwest Conference, the Big East for football, the Western Athletic Conference, which was once a powerful football league, and at some point the ACC. I do believe it's the same thing is going to happen to them. So just like the title of this podcast says, this is just a band-aid for the league. How long before that band-aid comes apart that is holding the ACC together, we just have to wait and see. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, it's only a matter of time before it falls off and the wound is fully exposed. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take this time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it will be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. Now you can check it out, drop a line, and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin, and I am signing off. And I'm saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.